The end of the War of 1812 confirmed America's permanent break with England. With the conflict finally over, citizens looked west, toward a vast, unexplored frontier, feeling a sudden, immense surge of momentum. The young republic found itself in a rare period of stability. The national debt was remarkably low, the economy was growing, and the new constitution seemed to be striking a working balance between liberty and order. The path forward looked clear for broad social progress. Among the leading statesmen, including Virginians like Thomas Jefferson, there was a widespread assumption that the country's original sin of slavery would slowly fade. Early leaders largely believed the institution was simply dying out on its own. But that optimism contained a massive blind spot. While politicians in the East celebrated their new political unity, looking toward the Western horizon revealed a very different reality. The sheer scale of the continent was about to expose a deepening fracture in the young nation. To hold this massive, growing territory together, Westerners pushed for a federally funded system of roads and canals. They needed physical arteries to link the distant frontier settlements back to the established eastern seaports. Congress also moved to secure economic independence through protectionism. They enacted high customs tariffs designed to shield domestic manufacturers, like iron smelters in Pennsylvania and wool shepherds in Vermont, from aggressive foreign competition. At the same time, the Supreme Court was rapidly consolidating federal power. Under Chief Justice John Marshall, the court issued a series of historic rulings that elevated the judiciary to a co-equal branch of government and firmly established national authority over individual state legislatures. On paper, the central government appeared stronger than ever. But its legal authority was about to collide with a regional economic divide that no court ruling or tariff could legislate away. In the 1790s, Eli Whitney's cotton gin suddenly allowed seeds to be separated from cotton at a massive scale. Right alongside it, the Industrial Revolution was equipping textile mills with high-speed machinery, creating a global demand for raw cotton. This line graph tracks the demand for raw cotton between 1790 and 1830, showing how demand spiked exponentially. Because of this single cash crop, slavery did not quietly fade away. These new economic factors made forced labor far more profitable than it had been a generation earlier. Cotton wasn't the only driver. Down in the hot, rich soils of southeastern Louisiana, planters realized the environment was perfect for growing sugarcane. By 1830, that single state was supplying half the nation's sugar, requiring incredibly labor-intensive cultivation. The country was now operating on two distinct tracks. The North was rapidly developing a free, wage-based society heavily invested in industry, while the South was doubling down on an agricultural economy entirely dependent on human bondage. The early statesmen had calculated wrong. Technological innovation did not solve the problem of slavery. It took a dying institution and turbocharged it, turning the plantation system into the incredibly lucrative engine of an expanding capitalist market. As both systems grew, they physically migrated. The free society of the North pushed horizontally across the top half of the continent, moving steadily into newly organized Western territories. Below them, the Southern slave economy was moving aggressively from the eastern tidewater states down into the lower South, flooding into the fertile Mississippi Delta and eventually stretching toward Texas. For a short period, politicians managed to keep a rough parity between the two sides. By the time Illinois joined the Union in 1818, the nation was perfectly deadlocked. 11 states permitted slavery and 11 states prohibited it. But the populations were not equal. The North was growing much faster, which gave northern states a permanent majority in the House of Representatives. For Southern politicians, their entire political survival rested on maintaining that exact tie in the Senate. In 1819, that math broke. Missouri applied to enter the Union as a slave state, bringing 10,000 enslaved people with it. Adding Missouri would tip the Senate majority toward the South, and Northerners rallied immediately to block the territory's entry. The country had simply run out of room to hide its central contradiction. The sheer physical growth of the United States had forced a complete legislative deadlock on the floor of Congress. To break the standstill, congressional leader Henry Clay engineered a complex political fix, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This map shows the trade that saved the Senate tie. Missouri entered as a slave state in orange, because Maine was admitted free in pink. Congress also drew a hard line, permanently banning slavery north of Missouri's southern boundary. In Washington, this provision was widely celebrated. To politicians at the time, it looked like a victory that had successfully diffused the crisis and kept the republic intact. But the reality of that boundary line was far darker. By carving the map into distinct, legally enforced zones, the federal government had officially institutionalized the divide. They had physically codified a split nation. Watching from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson saw exactly what this meant. He wrote to a friend that the geographic division, quote, "like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union." The post-war peace had been an illusion. Expanding the American map didn't solidify the young country. By pushing these two completely incompatible economic systems westward until they collided, expansion guaranteed that the conflict would end in the Civil War. In the 1810s, the United States was a fragile political experiment. Despite the rhetoric of liberty, the actual levers of domestic power were tightly controlled by a small, traditional elite operating quietly behind closed doors. But outside those quiet rooms, the map of the Western Hemisphere was catching fire. Spain and Portugal's massive empires in Central and South America were rapidly collapsing as a wave of popular revolutions gave birth to newly independent republics. These new nations faced an immediate existential threat. Across the Atlantic, a powerful coalition of European monarchies, known as the Holy Alliance, watched this democratic contagion with dread, and they actively prepared to cross the ocean and crush these revolutions by force. For the young United States, the stakes were suddenly twofold. Geopolitically, the nation risked being boxed in by hostile, expanding European empires. Internally, it remained a stagnant club run by the same few aristocratic families. The country had to make a choice: succumb to the pressure or assert its place in the world. Over the next 10 years, the United States would rewrite the rules of its independence on the global stage, while its citizens forced a complete restructuring of power within its own borders. The Latin American independence movements were remarkably successful. Led by figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, most of Hispanic America had successfully expelled European rule by 1822. Great Britain watched this shift closely. With the Spanish monopoly broken, London had established highly lucrative trade routes with these new republics. To protect those profits from the Holy Alliance, Britain proposed a joint Anglo-American military guarantee to defend Latin America. It seemed like a safe strategic bet to partner with the world's premier naval power. But Secretary of State John Quincy Adams convinced President James Monroe to reject the British offer. Adams argued the United States needed to project strength unilaterally, without hiding behind a European ally. He believed it would be more dignified to declare their principles independently, rather than, in his precise words, come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man-of-war. In December 1823, the president issued the declaration that would become the Monroe Doctrine. He explicitly stated that the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Monroe went further, warning the old empires that any attempt to extend their political system to the Americas would be viewed as dangerous to our peace and safety. Relying heavily on the unstated backing of the British Navy to actually enforce it, this declaration served as a geopolitical maneuver that transitioned the United States from a passive former colony into a dominant regional power, claiming an entire hemisphere as its sovereign sphere of influence. As the United States projected unity abroad, its domestic politics were breaking apart. The so-called era of good feelings violently collapsed during the chaotic four-way presidential election of 1824. Regional allegiances split the vote. Jackson, Adams, Crawford, and Clay carved out distinct blocks. With no candidate holding an electoral majority, the Constitution threw the deadlocked election into the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay held the most leverage. Clay threw his support behind John Quincy Adams, securing Adams the presidency.
When Adams immediately named Clay as his Secretary of State, it looked like a blatant backroom deal. The Jackson camp loudly branded it a corrupt bargain. Jackson had actually won the most electoral and popular votes initially, only to be denied the office. A frontier politician and famous hero from the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson weaponized his status as an outsider to fight back. Harnessing the outrage of voters who felt cheated by Washington elites, Jackson and his followers coalesced to establish the Democratic Party. They rallied around the principles of direct popular appeal and small, decentralized government. The 1824 election destroyed the illusion of political harmony. To the average citizen, the traditional system of congressional caucuses and elite deal-making had revealed itself as entirely rigged against them. State legislatures recognized this rising tide of popular anger and began changing how the country voted. In rapid succession, most states enacted universal white male suffrage and stripped away long-standing property requirements. A structural transfer of power quickly followed. Instead of state legislatures handpicking the Electoral College, presidential electors were chosen by direct popular vote. By the election of 1828, this vastly broadened voter base was fully mobilized. Propelled by the enthusiasm of the common people, Jackson defeated Adams in an overwhelming electoral landslide. In a single decade, the United States executed two distinct maneuvers that shaped its future. It locked European monarchies out of the Western Hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine, and it dismantled its own domestic aristocracy through the mechanics of popular democracy. The 1820s forced the young republic to grow up. By decisively rejecting foreign empires and traditional elites, the nation transferred political power to the voting public, drawing up the blueprint for its modern identity. By the late 1820s, regional competition had fractured the United States into a patchwork of conflicting economies. The North, South, and West followed divergent paths, creating deep fault lines across geography and class. In the Northeast, a growing manufacturing and merchant class relied on protective federal taxes on imported goods, known as tariffs, to keep their factories profitable. They also demanded a centralized banking system to maintain a stable, reliable money supply. In the South and West, agrarian societies viewed these centralized policies as tools of northern extraction. Southern planters, relying on the export of cotton grown by enslaved labor, felt these federal taxes enriched wealthy northern elites while leaving agricultural states significantly poorer. These tensions surfaced in two distinct crises. State legislatures began threatening to nullify or legally ignore federal laws they disliked. At the same time, loosely regulated state banks were issuing excess paper money, causing severe inflation and confusing local economies. Into this volatile environment stepped Andrew Jackson. Elected on a wave of populist anger, Jackson presented himself as a tribune of the people, explicitly claiming a mandate to protect the common citizen from entrenched political and financial powers. Jackson's response to these crises shifted the role of the president. By weaponizing his office against both defiant states and private financial institutions, he established a precedent for executive intervention that altered the federal government's internal balance. The first crisis ignited over the 1828 Tariff of Abominations. This aggressive protectionist tax on foreign imports forced agricultural states to pay higher prices for manufactured goods, severely straining the South Carolina economy. This map of the 1832 United States shows South Carolina standing in isolation. Led by John C. Calhoun, the state adopted an ordinance of nullification. They declared federal tariffs void within their borders and authorized funding a state military force. Jackson responded with immediate hostility, branding the nullifier's actions as treason. Backing his words with hard military power, he dispatched 7 naval vessels and a man-of-war directly to Charleston. To ensure absolute authority, Jackson pushed Congress to pass the Force Act. This granted the president the explicit legal authorization to deploy the United States Army to enforce federal law against American citizens. Facing the prospect of a federal invasion, South Carolina searched for an exit. Senator Henry Clay stepped in and sponsored a compromise bill that promised to gradually lower the tariff rates over the next decade. South Carolina accepted the deal and formally rescinded their nullification ordinance. An American president had successfully used the threat of military force against a state to preserve federal supremacy. While managing the threat of rebellion in the South, Jackson turned his executive power against an entirely different target, the Second Bank of the United States and its manager, Nicholas Biddle. As a private corporation holding government deposits, the bank acted as a powerful currency enforcer. By refusing to accept risky notes from smaller state banks, it maintained a prudent monetary policy. However, Southerners and Westerners resented this virtual monopoly over credit, believing it served a wealthy Northeastern elite. When congressional supporters pushed for an early renewal of the bank's charter, Jackson delivered a stinging veto. He denounced the institution as a monopoly built on special privilege, framing his opposition as a battle against a many-headed financial monster. Following his re-election victory, Jackson did not wait for the bank's charter to expire. Acting unilaterally, he ordered the withdrawal of federal funds from the central bank, redistributing the government's money into state institutions, his opponents called pet banks. By destroying the central bank on his own authority, Jackson took the presidential veto, originally a defensive constitutional safeguard, and turned it into an offensive ideological weapon. Jackson secured victories in both his geographic and institutional conflicts. He held the Union together and dismantled the financial monopoly he despised, but his tactics left deep fractures across the country. The nullification crisis demonstrated that a single state's resistance could force the national legislature to concede to its demands. That strategy proved to be a lasting lesson for future leaders of Southern secession. Meanwhile, the death of the central bank unleashed a flood of cheap credit through the state banking system. This fueled westward expansion, but it also stripped away financial guardrails, leaving the American economy vulnerable to periodic financial panics. The institutional void created by Jackson's veto lasted for generations. The United States would not establish another central banking system until the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Jackson claimed the mandate of the common people to dismantle financial giants and subdue rebellious states. Through these victories, he repositioned the presidency as a center of sweeping unilateral authority.
In the 1820s and 30s, the United States experienced a jolt to its political system. The introduction of universal white male suffrage handed unprecedented voting power directly to the common man, disrupting the traditional political order. But this newly expanded electorate was immediately tested. A severe economic depression swept across the country, bringing hard times, low wages, and widespread panic. This is a chart tracking immigration during the first half of the 19th century. Notice this massive, sudden surge. Thousands of Catholic immigrants, primarily from Ireland and Germany, began arriving in waves along the eastern seaboard. These new arrivals brought religious practices and customs that felt entirely foreign to native-born Protestant Americans. They also competed directly for jobs in already struggling coastal cities, triggering intense societal anxiety. Combine millions of new voters with an economic crash and shifting demographics, and you get a highly volatile electorate. Citizens demanded immediate solutions to their daily struggles, and the traditional political establishment was unequipped to provide them. The political opposition at the time eventually coalesced into the Whig Party. They were a fractured coalition of politicians who spent a decade failing to agree on a platform, united by little more than a shared hostility toward Andrew Jackson. The Democrats weren't faring much better. Martin Van Buren inherited the presidency right as the economic depression hit, leaving him and his party completely on the defensive. To capture this frustrated electorate in the 1840 election, the Whigs chose William Henry Harrison, promoting him as a hero of the West. His campaign targeted everyday citizens, leaning on the branding of Harrison and Reform to promise populist solutions. He won a sweeping victory, but died just 1 month after taking the oath of office. His vice president, John Tyler, immediately broke ranks with the Whig leaders in Congress, completely paralyzing the federal government. With Washington hopelessly deadlocked, everyday Americans realized that if they wanted to fix their communities, they couldn't wait for politicians. They had to use their new civic power to organize and shape society themselves from the bottom up. Empowered working-class citizens began driving a wave of grassroots movements, pushing to build a society that actually served their interests. Labor organizations led the charge. In 1835, skilled workers in Philadelphia successfully forced employers to abandon grueling dark-to-dark shifts in favor of a standardized 10-hour workday.
Other reformers recognized that expanded voting rights carried risks. Statesmen like Horace Mann argued that if every common man had a say in government, the survival of the republic required a literate, tutored electorate. Working men's organizations demanded free instruction for all children. State by state, this pressure led to the creation of the modern, tax-supported public school system that quickly spread throughout the North. Activists also took aim at the medical and justice systems. Dorothea Dix led a tireless campaign to rescue the mentally ill from wretched conditions in almshouses and prisons, forcing state after state to build hospitals focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. At the same time, the temperance movement gained mass traction as a social cure. Reformers organized to ban the sale of alcohol, hoping to eliminate the severe poverty and domestic violence associated with heavy drinking. In just a few decades, labor, education, and healthcare saw massive structural improvements. This wave of grassroots organizing proved that citizen-led action could successfully expand human rights and basic societal care. But those exact same newly acquired democratic tools were simultaneously weaponized to restrict society and attack new minority groups. Displaced patrician politicians and native-born Protestant workers explicitly blamed the influx of Catholic immigrants for their stagnant wages and their sudden loss of political dominance. Deep paranoia took root. Because the Catholic Church did not support the temperance movement, a popular conspiracy theory emerged claiming that the Vatican was actively trying to subvert the United States government by keeping Americans drunk. This nativist backlash birthed a highly organized secret society called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. When asked about their activities, members refused to answer, earning them the nickname the Know-Nothings. They quickly grew into a national political force with a strict exclusionary agenda. They wanted to completely ban all foreign-born citizens and Catholics from holding public office. Here we see a visual timeline of the standard 5-year path to citizenship. The Know-Nothings demanded this be extended, pushing the requirement out to a massive 21 years to delay immigrants from gaining the right to vote. Giving more people a voice in government does not guarantee progressive outcomes. The power to build a more inclusive society also empowers reactionary forces to push back and exclude those they view as a threat. By the mid-1850s, these grassroots factions had completely overshadowed the old debates between Whigs and Democrats. The Know-Nothings even won total control of the state legislatures in New York and Massachusetts, backed by roughly 90 United States congressmen. Yet, right as these social movements reached their absolute peak, an unresolved flaw in the American experiment overtook the national conversation. The gathering crisis over the extension of slavery violently consumed both the idealistic social reformers and the nativists. The intense sectional divide between the North and South completely destroyed the remaining Whig Party and fatally fractured the Know-Nothings, ending their brief political reign. The chaotic middle of the 19th century demonstrated that democratization is rarely clean. It creates an explosive, messy tension between those demanding inclusion and those demanding exclusion, a constant push and pull that remains a defining feature of the American system today. In the early 1800s, the physical reality of the American landscape was daunting. Looking west, citizens faced a vast wilderness that offered the promise of space, but for the average person, it remained almost entirely inaccessible. Many felt physically trapped. In New England, farmers struggled with thin, exhausted soil that refused to yield high grain harvests. Down in the backcountry of the Carolinas and Virginia, settlers were economically isolated by a lack of roads, leaving them at the mercy of wealthy coastal planters who dominated the political landscape. This physical confinement mirrored severe social borders. From colonial times, custom and law dictated that a woman's separate legal identity virtually vanished the moment she married. Women were barred from voting, their education was often limited to reading and needlework, and they were frequently forbidden from speaking in public spaces. These dual restrictions, a stifling legal code at home and an impassable geography to the west, created massive pressure. A restless energy took hold of a population desperate for land and autonomy. To break out of these boundaries, the nation would redraw the borders of the continent. But that growth would force a reckoning over who actually possessed the right to participate in this new society. Pushing against social boundaries began with individual acts of defiance. In the 1820s, a Scottish lecturer named Frances Wright toured the United States. In an era when women were silenced in public, she openly advocated for the right to divorce and information on birth control. By the 1840s, those individual voices coalesced into an organized movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott designed the architecture for the world's first women's rights convention. Gathering at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, they drafted a Declaration of Sentiments. Delegates unanimously demanded equal access to education and employment, but one resolution faced intense opposition: the demand for women's suffrage. That resolution only secured a majority after the Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass took the floor. His impassioned speech defending the vote as the only way for women to be equal to men finally tipped the scales for the convention. These organized efforts began dismantling the laws that erased women. That same year, Ernestine Rose helped push through the Married Women's Property Act in New York, which allowed married women to keep property in their own names rather than surrendering it to their husbands. Stanton saw that even with property rights, women remained dependent on a male-run legislature to grant them favors. She concluded that without the ballot, women would never have the power to protect their own interests. This shifted the movement's strategy. They would no longer just ask for better laws, but for the political power to write them. While activists challenged social borders in the East, thousands of pioneers began physically breaking out of their coastal confines. By 1800, the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys became a great frontier region for migrants escaping Eastern dominance. The first to push further were French and Scots-Irish fur trappers. They mapped the rivers and discovered the high mountain passes through the Rockies and Sierras, charting the routes that would make the overland migrations of the 1840s possible. Following those trails, hunter farmers converted the wilderness into established settlements. Through industrious labor, they cleared timber, built log houses with glass windows, and sowed productive seed to feed their families and future generations. Urbanization rapidly followed the plow. In 1830, Chicago was merely an unpromising trading village with a fort, yet within a single lifetime, it became one of the largest and richest cities in the nation. Two forces drove this surge. First, the government offered land for as little as $1.25 after 1820. Second, a cultural mandate popularized by editors like Horace Greeley urged young men to go west and grow with the country. The growth was enormous. Between 1812 and 1852, the population leaped from 7.25 million to more than 23 million. At the same time, the land available for settlement increased by over 3 million square kilometers. This explosive growth created an illusion of boundless democratic opportunity. But that narrative relied on ignoring the reality of the land they were claiming and the people who were already there. The American frontier was not an empty wilderness. Westward expansion led to a direct and violent collision with millions of indigenous inhabitants who had lived there for centuries. The federal government responded to this friction with military force. In Alabama, General Andrew Jackson led campaigns against the Creek Indians, forcing them to cede 2/3 of their land. He later routed bands of Seminoles from their sanctuaries in Florida. Federal strategy soon shifted from military suppression to legalized displacement. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, providing the funds to transport Eastern tribes to territories beyond the Mississippi River. Look at the bureaucratic scale of this policy. Over 8 years, the government signed 94 treaties, stripping millions of hectares from dozens of tribes and funneling them into a single territory in what is now Oklahoma. The Cherokee Nation, one of the most progressive Eastern tribes, faced immediate eviction the moment gold was discovered on their Georgia land in 1829. Forced on a cruel trek to Oklahoma known as the Trail of Tears, the tribe lost a staggering number of people to disease and exhaustion. While the map was being redrawn in the West, the battle over social borders continued to evolve. In 1869, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony founded the NWSA, aiming to incorporate their demands into the nation's founding document through a constitutional amendment. By 1860, the United States had nearly doubled its landmass, But this expansion left basic conflicts unresolved. The question of whether these new lands would be slave or free created a volatile sectional divide. These differences, rooted in the very fabric of how the nation grew, would eventually explode into the Civil War.